From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up, K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about improved profitability in biofuels production and the level of support that's giving to row crop prices currently as part of his weekly commentary on the grain market trends. Then K-State's J.P. Michaud will report on heightened activity of sugarcane aphid in some Kansas grain sorghum fields this past week, and he'll talk about why he believes this pest will eventually become a non-factor for you grain sorghum growers. He spoke on this topic at K-State's Row Crop Roundup Field Day earlier this week at Hayes. And on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp. All this and more straight ahead on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Welcome once again. Well, frankly, there's very little jazz, to put it that way, in the grain markets of late, but we'll find out from our guest now what might be the next market mover. Dan O'Brien, along with us via phone once again from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan, these are rather lethargic trades, especially on the futures right now, and we could start by noting that there is still interest in crop conditions out there, row crops that is, and some information coming in from an assortment of tours going on.
Yes, I would say that although it's a downtime in the market, still there are turbulent subcurrents going on out there with regard to questions about the size of U.S. crops, in particular on the corn side. As you'd mentioned, Eric, there are crop tours going on that have been going on this week, going through some of those key, the three I states, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, off also into Nebraska, and that have been giving us some idea of at least crop scouts as they're in the field and seeing conditions right now, what it looks like we may end up at with regard to yields in different areas. Should add in that southern Minnesota, are also a pretty important crop production area for corn, is in there too. They're looking at both corn and soybeans, but for soybeans, they're giving pod counts, etc., but probably deem it too early to come up with a projection. And that's the way soybeans are. We quote, make them in August, unquote, and we're just still in the middle of development there. So anyway, when you look at prospects for corn, really, as of about a week or two ago, the one risk that you had to wonder about was whether the dry conditions up in the Dakotas and Montana that had started to extend down into Iowa would extend any further. It does seem like we've had at least some moderate extension of those dry conditions through parts of Iowa off now into Illinois. Also have had reports from this crop tour of not so much dry conditions, but all the wet establishment problems that the corn crop had in Indiana are, quote, coming home to roost and having some impact on crop development there. Reading the individualized reports, you'll read from a Reuters news article that corn yield potential and soybean pod counts across western Iowa were down from a year or so ago. And again, not when we say down, not to the degree of a 2012 drought by any stretch, but down 5%, down 10%, something like that. A pretty similar situation, really, in Illinois. On a region-by-region basis, it's kind of up and down, but taken in total, Illinois corn yields projected to fall about 6.6 or 6.7% by these crop scouts as they had gone through that state. Indiana corn yield projected to be down at least marginally from what they'd had last year. Again, this tour had gone through Midwest Crop Tour, sponsored by Farm Journal, projected about 171 bushels per acre. Last year they had about 173.5 or 0.4 or something like that. Indiana also being down surprisingly, actually given the proximity of Nebraska to the dry conditions in the Dakotas. Actually, the Nebraska projection in the field rose about 4%. At least that's what the crop scouts were seeing. So, when you're dealing with the 3 I states, they being so important, particularly Iowa and Illinois, to U.S. Corn production and soybean production, but corn production in particular, to see some of these too dry or too wet conditions having some marginal or moderate impact on yields is a pretty big thing. So really, by the time we do the math and finish all that up, what does that do to the USDA's 14.1, 14.2 billion bushel projection that had come out on August the 10th? It probably raises the likelihood that we'd be looking at yields dropping from that figure down to below 14 to 13.9, 13.8, 13.6, really probably down closer to what the trade projections were coming into that August 10th report, which were running from 13.3 to 13.8, something like that. I think they averaged 13.8, but some major ones, 13.3, 13.5, 13.6. So anyway, if you do that, you end up with a situation, I think, where instead of 2.2 billion bushels of carryout, then gosh, if we take a 500 million bushels off of the size of this year's crop, then you're looking at something below 2 billion bushels, closer to 1.7, 1.8. Stocks to use more moderating and at least some moderate support for corn prices as we move on through harvest and on into the late winter and spring months.
And to add more to that theme, the International Grains Council has come out with its world grain production numbers updated, and within that, the corn projection from the IGC is to the downside.
Yes, quoting verbatim, the IGC cut its forecast for global corn or maize production in the new crop marketing year starting September 1 by 3 million metric tons down to 1 billion and change. And really, that's reflecting lower crop forecasts in both the European Union and in China. And, to the degree we see the U.S. numbers lowered in September, then we'd be added right into that. So it'd be the U.S., China, and the European Union. One thing that's holding up pretty strong is consumption. So to the degree that we see at least marginal cutbacks in production in some of these major countries and consumption holds up, then again, you're talking about a combination of supply-demand factors that would be supportive for prices and may give us some selling opportunities heading off into future months.
And trying to keep with the positive here, you have some new information on biofuel profitability that is encouraging on that demand side for both corn and soybeans.
Yes. When you look at trends here in August to date, basically going on a week-to-week basis through about August 18th, it looks like we have some profitability in the biofuel ethanol production sector. August price, again, through about the 18th, was about $1.49 a gallon for ethanol. The cost to produce it is about $1.43. So by those numbers, gosh, we're making about 6 cents a gallon. And, when you're producing lots of gallons, 6 cents is a big thing. And where did that come from? Well, you have corn prices moderating to weak. For a corn producer, that's not a good thing in the short run, but in the long run, we're using a lot of corn up. So that's good. And really kind of a surprising increase in distillers' grains prices of late. And again, our expectation, at least mine was, that distillers' grains would suffer right along with corn as a competitive product, and there'd be not much hope for prices to move higher. But a combination of ethanol prices holding sideways to decent, distillers' grains moving higher and corn moving lower adds to profitability for ethanol plants. So, again, if we have a solid and profitable ethanol sector moving forward, then we have all that much more chance to move through piles of grain, whatever size the crop we produce, and end up and eventually get to the place where buyers of grain, commercial buyers, just can't sit back and rest and just wait for the market to come to them. When they get to that point where they feel they have to bid up to make sure they have adequate supplies, then we see the market starts to move higher.
And as for grain export business, Dan, well, the value of the dollar remains low, and that has been a supportive factor as much as it could be. But we don't see much exciting there, and that includes wheat, where the sales have more or less trickled off.
Yes, if anything, for overall U.S. wheat exports, we had a week where we had shipments of about 18.3 million bushels. We needed about 18.5 million bushels to meet the USDA's August 10th projection for this 17-18 marketing year. And you know what? After the downside we've had in the wheat market to actually just about match the USDA's projection is kind of a victory. We'll take that. So sort of a neutral week in terms of export shipments, sales at this point in the marketing year of about 423 million bushels against shipments and sales together, about 43-44% of the USDA's projection when we're only we're 12 weeks into a marketing year, about 23% of the way. So really kind of a quiet positive there. Hard red winter wheat exports jumping a little bit higher again this week up to about 6.65 million bushels, down from what we would need to meet the USDA's projection. Again, when you look at what the IGC is saying and put two and two together, these strong crops, extremely strong crops that are emerging in the Black Sea region, Russia, Ukraine, even Kazakhstan holding up decently, are providing, again, front of the line, in front of us, in the U.S., competition for U.S. wheat exports. Of course, with their cheap currency and logistical locations relative to Egypt and other major markets, they seem to be in front of us right now. And our recovery in wheat prices probably has been delayed somewhat by their strong crop over there that competes directly with what we're selling here in the hard red winter wheat areas.
Well, when you pull it all together, it seems, Dan, in closing, that the next important catalyst for the markets will be the USDA September crop report. And until then, the markets may more or less muddle around for a while.
We're muddling around. I think that's probably as accurate of an economic term as we could come along with. But right now, I guess the mode to be in is to be happy that at lower prices we're moving grain, knowing that eventually, if we store grain past the first of the year, that strong movement now, if it continues on down the road, will eventually lead us to some better selling prices for ag producers.
Well, producers, check out Dan's weekly notes on the grain markets at agmanager.info. And as always, Dan, we appreciate your time and your input. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, that's Dan O'Brien. He's along with us every Friday here on Agriculture Today.
Man, it's hot out here. Heat stress affects more than just humans. It also affects livestock. Extreme heat, humidity, wind speeds, and cloud cover all make a difference in air temperature. To control problems, make sure your livestock have shade and water provided at all times. This will help prevent problems in breeding, meat production, and reduce chances of death. Please take all these into consideration for livestock production. Brought to you by K-State Animal Science Leadership Academy participants.
Tuned in to Agriculture Today, and now more information presented at that 2017 Row Crop Roundup Field Day, hosted earlier this week by K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. Last Tuesday on the broadcast, we talked with K-State entomologist Brian McCormick about the status of the sugarcane aphid threat to Kansas grain sorghum so far this year. You'll recall that Brian reported only limited aphid activity in the state as of last weekend. Well, Brian's counterpart stationed at Hays, crop entomologist J.P. Michaud, told the field day crowd that in the last few days, sugarcane aphid numbers have started to build up, at least in test plots at the center just south of Hays. What this relatively late rush of sugarcane aphid means to you growers depends in part on the stage of sorghum growth at the moment.
At this point in time, a lot of that early planted sorghum is turning color. It's pretty much safe. It's almost safe. Now, the later planted stuff is going to be vulnerable for quite a few more weeks. And so that's the stuff you really want to be vigilant, because if we have more hot temperatures like we had over the last weekend, these aphids are just, they can explode so quickly. And if you want to catch them early, you got to do some walking through your field, because when they start in just a little small spot. You can find that spot before they spread out over the whole field. You may not even have to treat the whole field.
And JP offers a suggestion on just where one might look first, if there's a tree grove somewhere nearby.
The first place you're going to find them is right on the north edge of a tree line. And the reason for that is that the wind is carrying the aphids passively on the southerly winds. And when wind passes over treetops, it creates turbulence. And that turbulence tends to knock the aphids out of the air column on the leeward side of the tree line. And so that's why I say, if you're, and it's the same is true for the cornleaf aphid, the green bug, and all those other aphids that tend to come up on the southerly winds. If you look along the north edge of a tree line, that's probably the first place you're going to find them.
Now, JP talked mostly at the field day about the longer-term outlook for the sugarcane aphid threat to grain sorghum in Kansas. And in short, he's expecting a positive outcome, largely in light of the fact that there are plenty of beneficial insects out there that can and are counteracting this aphid activity.
We've got the evolution of the natural insect community to consume these aphids before they get to economic levels. And in fact, this is what I've been saying for the last 3 years, is that the situation eventually will take care of itself. We have a community of beneficial insects out there already that keeps a dozen different species of aphids under control almost all the time, unless there's a disruption. And different things can happen to disrupt biological control, and you can have outbreaks. But it's the exception rather than the rule.
And this, in combination with the genetic plant resistance to sugarcane aphid that's being discovered, lends to JP's optimism that this pest will become a much lesser concern eventually.
The biological control interacting with a plant population that has reasonable levels of resistance, those two things together give you what I consider to be a permanent solution to the problem. Because the biological control supports the plant resistance, as I explained, and vice versa. The plant resistance slows the aphid down enough that the biological control can happen earlier and keep them at lower numbers. And because there's lower numbers, there's less evolution in the aphid population to overcome the plant resistance. And so what we find is when we have our management down to where we've encouraged biological control to be the best it can be, then we have resistance traits in the plants that remain effective for many, many years.
That's not to say that you producers should let your guard down against this pest. JP is still touting good cultural management to keep the sugarcane aphid at bay.
Planting date is the first thing, of course, and we know that we get infested later than down south, so getting the crop planted as early as possible is going to give you the biggest head start. I mean, that's the first number one cultural thing. No-till is beneficial simply because you tend to have two effects of no-till. The first one may not be that important to us because we're getting infested so late, but when the plants are small in a conventional field, you get higher aphid landing rates on those small plants than you do in a no-till, where actual residues in the soil break up the contrast of the plants in the soil. And so he actually reduces the landing rate of the aphids. As I say, it may not be much of a factor in this particular situation since we're getting infested quite late. But the other thing is you do tend to have better biological control in a no-till situation simply because of the structure of the litter on the soil. So you'll have detritivores and you'll have things that are decomposers and potentially prey for beneficial. So anything that increases insect diversity in the field is good. You know, we want to grow uniform monocultures. I understand. We want to produce a lot of grain per acre, you know, but we eliminate all the other plants, and these other plants provide resources to the beneficial insects. So almost all these aphid predators at some point in their life cycle, they need plant resources like pollen and nectar. There may be no aphids around, and they'll use these plant resources. Or certain life stages will need them. The sugars from the nectar to fly and find the aphids, for example. And of course, we don't want to see anything but sorghum out there. We don't want anything that's a wildflower as a weed if it's in the sorghum field. So maybe with a little more going easier on the herbicides in the less productive areas, you know, in the marginal vegetation, you can encourage some perennial flowering plants. That's going to help you keep those beneficial insects around on the farm. Remember, the aphids are migratory, but all those beneficial insects that eat them, they're residents. And so you have to ask yourself, for example, when the wheat matures, we produce large numbers of beneficial insects because the wheat has lots of aphids. Now, we don't spray those aphids. That's why we don't need to, because the natural enemies are taking care of them. But guess what? All those natural enemies come out of the wheat. Where are they going to go? If you got nothing flowering, if you got no other plants on your farm, they're just going to leave because they've got nowhere to survive until the summer crops come up and they have some other food.
And he adds that resistant hybrids will continue to be part of the answer against the aphid.
Almost every company selling sorghum seed out here has a couple of lines. They have they've already identified resistant parents in their breeding program. So the number of different hybrids being produced with some form of sugarcane aphid resistance is expanding. Okay, so there's lots of different sources of resistance out there fortuitously. So we're really lucky. We didn't have to go looking for it. We fortuitously have a lot of different resistance traits out there. And as they move these traits into different hybrids, there's going to be more and more choice of agronomic varieties with resistance to sugarcane aphid. And the really good thing is that they're all different sources of resistance. So we're not having strong directional selection on the aphids to overcome one source of resistance.
There is an online resource. We told you about it earlier this week in visiting with Brian McCormick. JP endorses it as well. The myfields.info site is tracking in real time whatever progression of the sugarcane aphid is out there in the state.
We encourage all producers to register on the MyFields website. It's for management of multiple crops, but right now we're using it to help us track the movement of sugarcane aphid. You can go on there, create an account, and you can get real-time live updates of what everybody's finding, and you can report finds in your own fields. If you're not sure, you can submit a photograph of what you found, and it'll come to the attention of an entomologist or a specialist like myself who will say, yes, this is what you have. It'll get confirmed, and then if you're a neighboring farmer and you're registered, you'll get an alert for your area, or anything that you want to be alerted for. And so if you sign up for alerts on sugarcane aphid and your neighbor finds sugarcane aphid, you'll see it. You'll get an alert on that. If it was found, even if it's found 2 counties away from you, you will know the same day somebody reports it and it's confirmed. And so it's a two-way street. You'll only get information and alerts that you're interested in, but we're interested in what you see too. So if you provide information about what you find, everybody benefits.
And by the way, that myfields.info site will help you with your scouting efforts.
Yes, and you'll download the scouting card there. It's 2 pages. It shows you how to look for the aphids, how to scout for them, and help you determine whether or not you have enough to warrant a treatment.
But the main takeaway from JP, the sugarcane aphid problem will run its course, in his estimation.
In a few years from now, I know it was really bad last year, but in a few years from now, sugarcane aphid is just going to be another curiosity out there like greenbug. For the past 10 years, nobody, but since before sugarcane aphid came, people had stopped worrying about greenbug. Well, they're still out there. They're just never really get to numbers where they can cause us much problem. It's going to be something you find once in a while and say, oh, look, sugarcane aphid, haven't seen that in a while. So, and as long as we have environmentally conscious cultural decisions in our cropping systems, we can count on that community of beneficial insects to help us out and prevent a lot of these pests from ever being economically significant.
Comments there from K-State crop entomologist J.P. Michaud on contending with sugarcane aphids in grain sorghum, as shared at the Row Crop Roundup Field Day this past Wednesday at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. Now to today's agricultural news headlines for you in brief, courtesy in part of DTN. Canadian and Mexican officials have stated now they will continue to stay focused on the negotiations under the North American Free Trade Agreement. That following comments from President Trump that he still sees potential to exit the pact. Quoting Prime Minister for Canada Justin Trudeau, "We're going to stay focused on what we've already known and have always said." He said that NAFTA benefits both Canadians and Americans and that Canada is, quoting here, "focused on the hard work we have ahead of us at the negotiating table." And Mexico's Foreign Minister Luis Videgaray said that Mexico will remain at the table with, as he put it, serenity and firmness and national interest ahead. He says if President Trump really wanted to break up NAFTA, he would have done so already. Now, the president, you'll recall, said at a Phoenix rally Tuesday that he personally did not believe that we can make a deal on NAFTA, quoting him, "So I think we'll end up probably terminating NAFTA at some point." Trump's remarks came just days after negotiators for the three countries met in Washington last week for the inaugural round of talks to revamp the deal. The next round will begin September the 1st in Mexico. The U.S. ethanol industry is exploring its options now following Brazil's decision on Wednesday to impose a 20% tariff on ethanol imports from the U.S. About 8% of ethanol produced here in the United States is exported, with Brazil accounting for about 25% of those exports. So Brazil's decision to levy a 20% tariff on those imports will undoubtedly have some effect on U.S. producers, as that it will be much more expensive to export to Brazil, of course. Brazil Minister of Agriculture, Livestock and Supply Blairo Maggi announced the tariff will take effect after a 158 million gallon tariff rate quota was implemented. The action was taken by the Brazilian Chamber of Foreign Trade, CAMEX as it's called. The President and Chief Executive Officer of the Renewable Fuels Association, Bob Dineen, told DTN yesterday that his group is still looking at the potential options for a response. The tariff probably doesn't mean U.S. producers will stop exporting to Brazil. Brazil, he says, does not have enough ethanol, and he said he doesn't know how the marketplace will respond yet. He said he didn't think that the U.S. will take this lying down, in his words. More broadly, Dineen said the U.S. ethanol industry is more concerned about an international trend toward adopting protectionist policies when it comes to biofuels. U.S. producers have faced similar situations recently with the likes of the European Union and Peru. Dineen called Brazil's action short-sighted in an era when biofuels industries around the world are working to strengthen their foothold in the market. Along with Dineen, U.S. Grains Council President and CEO Tom Slight and Growth Energy CEO Emily Skor issued a statement on Wednesday following Brazil's announcement. They said that the tariff rate set to be in place for the next 2 years would be stymieing to the access to a large growing market for U.S. ethanol exports, that being Brazil. And as of March, by the way, Brazil was the top export target for U.S. ethanol producers, who shipped 36 million gallons plus that month. That's according to government trade data compiled by the Renewable Fuels Association. And the EPA originally proposed a much higher cellulosic ethanol number in its renewable fuel standard proposal sent to the Office of Management and Budget back in June. In that proposal, the EPA originally called for 384 million gallons for the cellulosic renewable volume obligation, which would have been an increase above the 311 million gallons for 2017. The June 23rd version of that draft rule, however, sets that number at 238 million gallons, making total volume in the RFS even lower. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and next up for you this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop. And waiting with that is Marsha Boswell. Marsha?
Kansas Wheat is proud to announce the winners of the 8th annual Kansas Wheat Yield Contest. This year's top wheat yields belong to Spencer West of Leroy, Eastern Region winner, Richard Seck of Hutchison, the Central Region winner, and Alec Horton of Horton Seed Services in Leota, the Western Region winner. Spencer West is the overall winner for the 2017 Kansas Wheat Yield Contest with a new contest record. He is also a repeat winner in this year's Eastern region. West's winning plot was 5 acres planted with Westbred's WB cedar and resulted in a yield of 123.75 bushels per acre, a Kansas Wheat Yield Contest record. This is West's second consecutive regional win in the contest, and he made a splash this year with a record Eastern region yield for the Kansas Wheat Yield Contest. Richard Seck is this year's Central region winner. His plot was 7 acres, planted with Lima Grain's LCS Mint. His prize-winning yield was 115.29 bushels an acre. Alec Horton is this year's Western region winner. He achieved a yield of 93 bushels per acre on his 5.98-acre plot of Westbred's WB grain field. Horton is another repeat regional winner in the Kansas Wheat Yield Contest. Last year's plot smashed the record books with a yield of 121.48 bushels an acre. Best management practices are key for winners of the Kansas Wheat Yield Contest. All 3 winners used treated seed on no-till ground. In addition, winners used innovative fertilizing techniques and protected their investments with fungicide applications. For more agronomic information on this year's winners, visit kansaswheat.org/yieldwinners. According to Justin Gilpin, CEO of Kansas Wheat, hosting the Kansas Wheat Yield Contest is an exciting part of what we do here. We're proud to recognize farmers across the state for their dedication to good management practices and celebrate their successes. The 2017 Kansas Wheat Yield Contest is sponsored by Lima Grain, Westbred, Kansas Wheat Alliance, AgriPro Syngenta, ADM Milling, and Kansas Wheat. Winners of the contest receive a $1,000 prize that will be awarded on September 14th by the governor at the Kansas State Fair. Each winner will also receive a $500 prize awarded by the company whose variety they planted. In addition, the contest also has the optional quality initiative. Participants collect a sample of their wheat, which will then be graded and analyzed by ADM Milling for various quality components. This winner will be announced by the governor at the state fair. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marsha Boswell.
Thanks, Marsha. And after the final break, we'll take up the potential impact of Hurricane Harvey on Kansas agricultural weather with K-State's Mary Knapp here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather and our weekly report from the Weather Data Library here at K-State. Alongside is Research and Extension climatologist at the university, Mary Knapp, who spent the early part of the week, Monday to be exact, doing what a lot of folks were doing, tracking the solar eclipse. And we talked about this last week, Mary. You were at the library station in northeast Kansas near Hiawatha and actually gathering information on the eclipse and the climatological factors surrounding it, and that's all posted online now for folks to reference.
Right. Basically what we did was for the 6 stations closest to the path of totality, we were monitoring 1-minute data, and online we were graphing the temperature and the solar radiation, which were the areas you were most likely to see impacts. But we also had wind and pressure and precipitation. All of those are in there. That data has been archived, so it's in a zip file. There is one file that just has the temperature and solar radiation, and another file that has all of the data. And, of course, that second file is a lot larger. We, in addition to that, have a couple of images from different locations. We had Dan Regier, who is our programmer, was up in Marysville, and he took some photos there. My brother was near Seneca, and he generously shared a couple of images. And then, of course, there are my photographs from Hiawatha. It was less than ideal, would probably be the way to phrase it. We had broken clouds periodically through the morning, but at the time of totality, it was pretty much covered with clouds. Still, you could see very dramatic differences in the light during that time. It was very much dark as night, and there are some photographs that I took that showed that. I tried to take a picture of the clover that was there at the edge of the field, and you see this black blob that that was a camera image, but the other thing that was disappointing was that despite all the clouds and regular drizzle, the amount of precipitation that we saw up at Hiawatha was very limited. There was only about 1/100th of an inch during that time that I was there.
And they need the moisture up in that region.
Yeah, definitely. They are in that abnormally dry conditions. Clouds continued to build through the day more to the south of the Kansas River, and of course we know areas of Douglas County, Johnson County, Miami County, east central and southern parts of the Northeast Division got tremendous amounts of rain with the attendant flooding that comes with that. So it was kind of a mixed bag as far as the precipitation goes.
Before we forget it, to note to folks, if they'd like to tap into that information on the day of the eclipse and what they gathered, as Mary described it, mesonet.ksu.edu. That's mesonet.ksu.edu. The latest drought monitor, having mentioned that there were those torrential rains, as you note, in eastern Kansas, what does it tell us?
Well, the torrential rains, unfortunately, fell in areas that were already very much saturated, which aggravated the flooding in those regions. We did carve a little bit of the abnormally dry conditions out of more of the western part of northeastern Kansas. Parts of Pottawatomie County and Riley County were moved out of that because we've been favorably moist in August. But we also had an expansion of the moderate drought in central and south central and in the eastern parts of the western divisions where they haven't seen the rain. They've seen some, but they're still behind what they would normally be. Conditions haven't deteriorated into the severe drought, mainly because our temperatures have been more moderate than they were in July. So that's allowed what moisture has fallen to be more beneficial.
As we consider the outlook, Mary, all eyes at the moment are on the Texas Gulf Coast region where Hurricane Harvey is to eventually make landfall. And the question here is, will Harvey or its remnants likely impact our conditions?
At this point, it's very difficult to say whether or not we will get any of that spin-off moisture from Harvey. It's anticipated that it will move very, very slowly, and so that will complicate the flooding issues in Texas, but will make it more difficult to see where that moisture will make its way afterwards. At this point, our outlook for the next week is basically for drier than normal conditions, so they're not really anticipating a whole lot of that moisture making its way this far north. That can change. That can change very, very quickly. So we'll just have to keep our eye on it and watch and see what happens with that. There is some indication that more of that moisture will move into West Texas, into Colorado, and maybe in parts of western Kansas. But again, that's still to be determined, and a lot will depend upon exactly where it makes landfall.
Now, there is a modest chance for rainfall this coming weekend, but that really isn't related directly to Harvey.
No, that's more from a frontal system that is expected to make its way through here. The chances are in the 30 to 40% range. The quantitative precip forecast amounts are not particularly dramatic. We're looking at quarter to maybe 3/4 of an inch of rain, depending upon where it's at. There may be pockets of higher amounts, but it doesn't look like the intense rains that we saw on Monday Tuesday in eastern Kansas.
And then, as you noted, that dry stretch throughout the rest of the next week, but it'll be relatively mild still as well.
Yeah, the temperatures are expected to continue this cooler than normal trend. We're looking at highs in the mid-80s with lows in the upper 50s, low 60s. So again, very typical for this time of the year. A little bit cooler than normal on the high temperature side. But again, as we move into our fall, which we are heading that direction, those daily average highs drop significantly. From the 1st of September to the end of September, it's a rather sharp drop in those average highs.
Too early to declare that the intense heat of summer is behind us then?
Oh, yes, because we have had, even with a cool August, we have had high temperatures in the 100-degree range well into October.
So don't rule that out entirely. But for now, enjoyable conditions out there. Mary, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Research and Extension climatologist at K-State. That's Mary Knapp. And we bid you a good weekend. Thanks for tuning in, and please rejoin us on Monday, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.